He was a great mariner of the kingdom of Numenor, an explorer of the lands of Middle-earth. And while his sea longing would lead to great wealth and power for his kingdom, it would plant the seeds of enmity between the Númenóreans and the kingdoms of men in Middle-earth. And ultimately, it would cause the collapse of his marriage. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the lives of Tar Aldarion and Erendis. Aldarion is born in April of the year 700 of the Second Age, in the region of Forostar, the northernmost promontory of the island of Numenor. Originally named Anardil, he is the son of the fifth king of Numenor, tar-meneldur, and his wife, Almarian. He grew swiftly and was soon known as Aldarion, believed to mean son of trees. From an early age, Aldarion had a deep love for the sea, a passion encouraged by his maternal grandfather and captain of the king's ships, Veantur. But it would eventually become a point of contention between him and his father. In 725 of the Second Age, Veantur would invite Aldarion to join him on a voyage to Middle-earth. "My own years are far greater, and I do not think I shall often again have the heart to leave my fair house and the blessed shores of Numenor. But once more at least I will ride the great sea and face the north wind and the east. This year you shall come with me, and we will go to Mithlond and see the tall blue mountains of Middle-earth and the green land of the Eldar at their feet. Good welcome will you find from Círdan the shipwright and from King Gil-galad. Speak of this to your father." Aldarion would speak to his father of this journey, and Meneldur would grant his leave, though uneasily. "Do as your heart calls, Onya," he said. "I shall miss you sorely, but with Veantur as captain, under the grace of the Valar, I shall live in good hope of your return. But do not become enamored of the great lands, you who one day must be king and father of this isle." Aldarion would then sail to the Grey Havens in Lindon, on board the ship Numenor, or West Wings. On this journey, the young Aldarion would meet and befriend both Círdan and Gil-galad. 2 years later, he would return home to Numenor to the great joy of his father. However, the joy was short-lived, as Aldarion soon begged leave to sail again. In 730 of the Second Age, he would sail the Númenor back to Lindon, a journey that would last 3 years. In 735, Aldarion would sail yet again, but this time he would venture further from Lindon. He would sail south, exploring the coasts of the Grey Havens, past the mouths of the rivers Baranduin, Gwathlo, and Eisen, then around the cape of Ras Morthil to the bay of Belfalas, and the mountains of the country of Amroth. Finally, he would return home in 739. The following year, Aldarion's paternal grandfather, Tar-Elendil, the fourth king of Numenor, would relinquish his scepter to Aldarion's father. For a time, Aldarion would cease his voyages to stay in Armenelos for the comfort of his father. However, it would not last long. Aldarion would make one final journey in the Númenor to Middle-earth, sometime between the year 740 and 750. Around this time, the Druidine, who were living in Numenor, become uneasy of Aldarion's travels and urge him not to go, foreseeing some mischief to come. Aldarion would ignore these warnings and continue his voyages to Middle-earth. In 750, Aldarion would found the Guild of Venturers, a brotherhood of seamen and mariners dedicated to exploring distant shores. The guild would not have a hall upon land, but rather would reside on Aldarion's newly built ship, Eambar, meaning sea-dwelling. To the anger of his father, Aldarion would depart Armenelos to dwell on his ship. Tar-meneldur looked coldly upon the sea longing of his son, fearing it would lead to restlessness and a desire to rule over other lands. This would lead to an estrangement between father and son. But Aldarion's mother, Almarian, supported her son's endeavors, so tar-meneldur would begrudgingly let matters proceed unhindered. However, in an attempt to curb Aldarion's activities, tar-meneldur would prohibit and restrict the felling of trees for shipbuilding. This would ultimately fail, as Aldarion would simply seek further timber supplies in Middle-earth. On one of these voyages, Aldarion and the guild would found the Harbour Hirilonde, or New Haven, located at the mouth of the river Gwathlo. From this new port, the Númenorians would begin harvesting trees from the surrounding forests. Soon, Hirilonde would become the first permanent Númenorian settlement in Middle-earth, and one of their primary shipyards. In 800 of the Second Age, tar-meneldur would command his son to cease his voyaging, for Aldarion was now 100 years old, the age at which he could be proclaimed the king's heir. For a time, the two were reconciled, as Aldarion accepted his duty as prince and heir. But just 6 years later, Aldarion would seek to go to sea once again. Tar-meneldur would give leave grudgingly, and Aldarion would set out on a 7-year voyage to Middle-earth, returning with great quantities of silver and gold ore. Upon Aldarion's return in 813, the king would forbid his son to leave again. However, the prince would defy the command and make leave 3 years later to sail upon his newly built ship, the Palaran, or Far Wanderer, the greatest ship that had ever been built in Numenor. At this time, tar-meneldur and Almarian begin encouraging Aldarion to marry. In an effort to combat his sea longing, Meneldur would command that the women of his house were not allowed to give him a bow of oyolere, a traditional blessing of the Númenorians, before he embarked on his forbidden journey. But one among them defied the command, Erendis. Erendis was born in 771 of the Second Age. The daughter of Beregar and descendant of the House of Beor, she was praised for her beauty. In 800, her father would bring her to the feast, during which Prince Aldarion would be proclaimed the king's heir. There she was moved by the beauty and splendor of the prince, though for her part, she would go unnoticed by him. However, Queen Almarian would notice her beauty and would soon enter her into the queen's household, where she would be held in great esteem. In 816, as Aldarion prepared to depart, Erendis would arrive at the harbor, carrying a bow of return. It was at this moment that Aldarion first began to love her, and it is said that rather than looking out toward the sea, he instead stood long looking back. And it is also said that he hastened his return, being gone for less time than he had intended. Upon his return in 820, he would bring back gifts for his mother and the ladies of her house. But in gratitude for her kindness and as a token of his love, he brought Erendis the richest gift of all, a diamond. However, Aldarion would still hold his love for the sea, and in 824, he would depart again with 7 ships bound for Middle-earth, despite his father forbidding him to do so. He would return 5 years later, having acquired 2 more ships and a cargo of timber. But it was feared by some, including tar-meneldur, that the venturers were carrying a far deadlier cargo. Some of the Númenorian crews that participated in the first voyages of exploration to the far south and east of Linden had acquired diseases that were common in the lands where they traveled. Many feared that venturers would bring these diseases back to the island of Numenor, where it could spread unchecked. Though it would turn out that few of the explorers would die on their travels, and those who were sick would quickly recover upon returning to Numenor. However, these fears were one of the chief reasons why tar-meneldur would oppose the longer voyages of his son. Beyond forbidding the felling of trees in Numenor, tar-meneldur would go so far as to shut the shipyards of Romena. So when Aldarion prepared to depart again that same year, he did so with only 3 ships. To the great discomfort of his father, he would not return for 14 years. Aldarion would first sail to Hirilonde, then began exploring south, reaching as far as the lands of Harad, where he would barely escape shipwreck. He would then return to Hirilonde near the end of his voyages to discover it had been ravaged by floods and plundered by hostile men. For at this time, the deforestation in the lands of Enenwaith and Meniriath had greatly angered the local population. At some point during this time, the achievements of Aldarion would become known to the Dark Lord Sauron, who was beginning to plot his return to power in Middle-earth. Learning too that the elves had established the great realm of Eregion, and that there was a great friendship between Aldarion and Gil-galad, he would forego Eriador for now, in favor of the lands of Mordor. There he would build his stronghold to counter the coming threat. At last, in 843, Aldarion would return to Numenor, and there he would stay for a time, for he would fall deeper in love with Erendis, and in the spring of 858, they were betrothed. When it was announced, Aldarion offered his wife-to-be jewels, but she declared she only desired one jewel, the diamond he had brought to her those many years ago. She then had it set in a silver fillet, and Aldarion bound it about her head, and she became known as Tar-Elestirne, Lady of the Starbrow. However, Aldarion would delay their marriage to make another voyage to Middle-earth in 863. Erendis would resent this, but grudgingly allowed him to depart. She would dwell in the Emerie region in central Numenor, where she would live in a white house, built for her as a betrothal gift from tar-meneldur. This house would come to be known as the White House of Erendis. Coming to Hirilonde, Aldarion would find the great harbor ravaged by storms yet again. What is more, he would learn that men near the coast had grown afraid of the Númenóreans and had increased their open hostilities against them. He would even hear rumors that a great lord in Middle-earth hated the Númenóreans. After rendering aid to the port settlement, Aldarion would return to the Grey Havens, where he would stay for a while with Círdan the shipwright. Aldarion would return home in 869, finally marrying Erendis the following year. However, their relationship had grown strained, for Erendis felt that Aldarion's love for the sea eclipsed his love for her. At a feast that midsummer, Aldarion's cousin Valendil tried to honor the princess by calling her Uinenniel, meaning daughter of Uinen, the Maya of the seas. But Erendis would reject the title, claiming that the Lady Uinen was her foe. Aldarion would respond to this. For his part, his foe was the Vala Orome, referring to Erendis's love for the forest and all that grew upon land. In 873, Aldarion and Erendis would have their first and only child, a daughter named Ancalimë. Despite his new daughter, and Erendis's clear resentment, Aldarion resolved to return to the sea, and when Ancalimë was just 4 years old, he set sail once more for Middle-earth, promising to return in 2 years. Aldarion would embark on the greatest ship yet built by the Númenóreans, the Hirilonde, or Haven Finder. So great and mighty was its size that people wondered at it, and called it Turumfanto, or wooden whale. However, so great had the rift in their marriage grown that Erendis would not place a bow of return on its prow, leaving it to the wife of Aldarion's captain to bestow. And thus Aldarion would depart, traveling to the Grey Havens. In deep resentment, Erendis leaves the capital, taking Ancalimë with her to her white house in Emerie. There she would raise and educate the young girl, instructing her in the history of Numenor, and even learning and adopting the Elven tongue as her primary language. For Erendis disliked Adunaic, the language preferred by Aldarion. By this point, Erendis had become bitter towards men, and strove to keep them out of her and Ancalimə's life, keeping a household of mostly women. The young girl would grow to love the land as her mother did, and would lose all memory of her father. It wasn't until she was 7, 3 years after Aldarion had departed, that she would learn who her father was. One day, a boy from a distant farm came on an errand to the White House. It would be Ancalimə's first encounter with a boy. He was swiftly dismissed by a servant, Zamin, Ancalimə's only childhood companion. She asked Zamin, "What noisy thing was that?" Zamin told her that it was a boy. When Ancalimë asked if the boy had a father, Zamin told her that his father was one of the venturers who had gone to sea with her father, the Prince Aldarion. This shocked Ancalimë, for it was the first time she had heard anything about her father. She would later ask Erendis if it was true, if Aldarion was indeed her father, and when he would return. This greatly angered Erendis. Finally, when Ancalimë is 9 years old, Aldarion would return to Numenor, 5 years after departing, 3 years after his promised time. He would come bearing with him a letter from Gil-galad for the king. However, due to his anger at Aldarion for voyaging against his command, Meneldur did not discuss the letter with him when it was delivered, instead telling Aldarion to seek his wife in Marya. Aldarion would ride in haste to the White House, where he would find a cold welcome from Erendis awaiting him. In the morning, he would make to leave, and would not deal with Erendis on her own ground, instead desiring her to bring his daughter back to Armenelos. However, Erendis was waiting for him by the door. "You leave more promptly than you came, my lord," she said. "I hope that, being a mariner, you have not found this house of women irksome already, to go thus before your business is done. Indeed, what business brought you hither? May I learn it before you leave?" "I was told in Armenelos that my wife was here, and had removed my daughter hither," he answered. "As to the wife, I am mistaken, it seems. But have I not a daughter?" "You had one some years ago," she said, "but my daughter has not yet risen." "Then let her rise, while I go for my horse," said Aldarion. Ancalimë was sent for, and standing upon the threshold she met her father, whom she did not recognize. But Aldarion would smile within, perceiving that she was indeed like him, despite Erendis's teaching. He would then promise to her she would one day become his heir, regardless of the succession laws of Numenor. He then departed for Armenelos. It was not until his son's departure that Meneldur looked at the letter and beheld the message upon it. "Given at Mithlon to the hand of the Lord Aldarion, king's heir of Númenor, to be delivered to the High King at Armenelos in person." Breaking the seal, he would read, "Eirenion Gil-galad, son of Fingon, to tar-meneldur of the line of Eärendil, greeting. The Valar keep you, and may no shadow fall upon the Isle of Kings. Long I have owed you thanks, for you have so many times sent to me your son, Anardil Aldarion, the greatest elf friend that now is among men, as I deem. At this time I beg your pardon, if I have detained him overlong in my service, for I have had great need of the knowledge of men and their tongues which he alone possesses. He has dared many perils to bring me counsel. Of my need he will speak to you, yet he does not guess how great it is, being young and full of hope. Therefore, I write this for the eyes of the King of Númenor only. A new shadow arises in the east. It is no tyranny of evil men as your son believes, but a servant of Morgoth is stirring, and evil things wake again. Each year it gains in strength, for most men are ripe to its purpose. Not far off is the day, I judge, when it will become too great for the Eldar unaided to withstand. Therefore, whenever I behold a tall ship of the kings of men, my heart is eased. And now I make bold to seek your help. If you have any strength of men to spare, lend it to me, I beg. Your son will report to you, if you will, all our reasons. But in fine, it is his counsel, and that is ever wise, that when assault comes, as it surely will, we should seek to hold the Westlands, where still the Eldar dwell, and men of your race whose hearts are not yet darkened. At the least we must defend Eriador, along the long rivers west of the mountains that we name Hithaiglia, our chief defense. But in that mountain wall there is a great gap southward in the land of Calenarthon, and by that way inroad from the east must come. Already enmity creeps along the coast towards it. It could be defended and assault hindered, did we hold some seat of power on the nearer shore. So the Lord Aldarion long has seen. At Hirilonde by the mouth of Guathlo, he has long labored to establish such a haven, secure against sea and land, but his mighty works have been in vain. He has great knowledge in such matters, for he has learned much of Círdan, and he understands better than any the needs of your great ships. But he has never had men enough, whereas Círdan has no wrights or masons to spare. The king will know his own needs, but if he will listen with favor to the Lord Aldarion and support him as he may, then hope will be greater in the world. The memories of the First Age are dim, and all things in Middle-earth grow colder. Let not the ancient friendship of Eldar and Dúnedain wane also. Behold, the darkness that is to come is filled with hatred for us, but it hates you no less. The great sea will not be too wide for its wings if it is suffered to come to full growth. Manwe keep you under the one, and send fair wind to your sails. This letter would greatly trouble the king, both for the warning of a dark lord in Middle-earth and for the estrangement between him and his son. Debating whether or not to give aid, Meneldur resolves to pass the scepter of Númenor to Aldarion, recognizing his knowledge of the situation is greater than his own. Meneldur would send a letter to Erendis, commanding her to come with Ancalimë to Armenelos. Erendis would refuse the command, remaining in Marya, but she would permit Ancalimë to go. And so, in the spring of 883, Tar Aldarion becomes the 6th king of Númenor. At once he sought to leave for Middle-earth again, sailing to Mithlond in the Hirilonde. No bow of return was set upon its prow, but rather the image of an eagle with a golden beak and jeweled eyes, a gift to Aldarion from Círdan. Aldarion would make several voyages to Middle-earth over the nearly 100 years that followed his coronation. In Unfinished Tales, we read, "It is also stated that no records are now left of the later voyages that Aldarion made, but that it is known that he went much on land as well as sea, and went up the river Guathlo as far as Tharbad, and there met Galadriel. There is no mention elsewhere of this meeting, but at that time Galadriel and Celeborn were dwelling in Eregion, at no great distance from Tharbad." In 892, Aldarion would permanently change the Numenorean law of succession, as he pronounces Ancalimë his heir. It is said he did this for reasons of private concern rather than policy, and out of his long resolve to defeat Erendis. As for the later lives of Aldarion and Erendis, not much is said. Aldarion continued to make voyages to Middle-earth until his final voyage in 985. In 1075, he would relinquish the scepter to Ancalimë, making her the first ruling queen of Númenor. Aldarion would die 23 years later, at the age of 398, and it is said that after his death, Tar Ancalimë would neglect her father's policies and stop sending aid to Gil-galad. But we'll cover the tale of her life and deeds in another video. As for Erendis, we find in Unfinished Tales, of Erendis it is said that when old age came upon her, neglected by Ancalimë, and in bitter loneliness, she longed once more for Aldarion, and learning that he was gone from Númenor on what proved to be his last voyage, but that he was soon expected to return, she left Marya at last, and journeyed unrecognized and unknown to the haven of Romena. There it seems she met her fate, but only the words, Erendis perished in water in the year 985 remain to suggest how it came to pass. And so ends the tale of Aldarion and Erendis, a tragic story that would come to define much of the Second Age and the relationship between Númenor and Middle-earth. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Viking Lord, Alvin Einbert, Jeremy Daniel Derby, Madame Director, Freya Firestar, Chris and Meg Q, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Z and N, Evely, Kia, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.